We all have a decision to make. Everybody in this chapel. Do we use our talents for ourselves? Or do we use our talents for others? And it's a struggle that goes on our whole lives long. Now think about it for a second in the story we're seeing today in the gospel, where James and John come and ask Christ, can we sit at your right hand and your left hand? Okay, let's get a little bit of backstory here so this makes sense, so we know what's going on. We already know from other accounts, from other part of the story, that the apostles had been talking among themselves about who was the greatest. That's the backstory here. And I think we need to focus in on that because that will give us a ton of light and help us understand the gospel passage a lot more. Now, a method that I use that helps me a lot is, I hone in on that moment when the apostles are talking among themselves about who is the greatest. It helps me a lot to use the tool of analogy. We're doing a course on analogy right now, and someday, you'll all be taking this amazing course. But we'll give you a little preview. And I don't like to promote, but anyway. I know it's wrong, but I shouldn't do it. So an analogy is you go back inside yourself and you try to find a moment when we did the same. And when we do that, something extraordinary happens. We not only start to understand the gospel passage more, but we start to understand ourselves more. It's an analogy. It sort of works both ways. And so I do remember a time when we were candidates, and there was 8 of us, 7 or 8, and we were there in Dublin, and this conversation started. Of course, not with these words, but it was exactly the same. And it was, who was going to get the most important job when we were novices? Now, you'd have to take into account that many of us in that group, we were from the club, we were from the ECYD, so we knew the novitiate. That's where we had our club, our youth club. So we knew the ins and outs of the novitiate. And so for some reason, we decided that the most important job in the novitiate was whoever was the receptionist. Well, because as kids, it's the brother we saw most. It looked like, he had more contact with the world, was in on the gossip, the whole thing. We had it all figured out. And we were arguing among ourselves about who was going to be the receptionist. And this went on and on and on. And until Father Hugh Ryan, who was in charge of the council, said, enough of that. Enough. So look at what's happening here. And so I think we can draw 3 points from the analogy that will help us get into this passage. It's also very humorous that they're all talking about who's the greatest, and then these 2 brothers, they cut in and they make this bad move and, break the rules of fair fighting, and that's what's going on here. This one has tension because this conversation's been ongoing, and they made this move. And we know from another passage they got their mom involved. It was not good. So anyway, there's 3 points. Again, what are we trying to do? We're trying to delve into what's going on here, understand what motivates this, and then also get to know ourselves. If we find a moment when we did it, it'll help ourselves. The first thing is, when Father Hugh Ryan called our attention, it was at dinner, because it was at dinner. At the meals, we used to argue about this. When he said to us, enough, we all understood we were being silly. We understood that he was right and we were being just silly and we got carried away. We understood that. And I think even more in the Legionaries of Christ, where we are called, it's part of who we are, not to look for positions. it made us look even sillier. And I think, too, the apostles, it helps us grasp the apostles. They were called by vocation not to go around looking for positions of authority. They were called. Christ would then explain it to them, and he would put it into words. But even before he put it into words, they knew that. Just like we did. Think about it. Here I am. That was 1975. How many years later? And I still remember the moment. I still remember the feeling absolutely silly. The second point, I think, is that it highlights the struggle inside us, the question, the decision, the ongoing decision: do we use our talents for ourselves, or do we use them for others? Why? Because, especially as legionaries, and not just as legionaries, because we do, there's many years of formation, so, we learn things, and we can make the decision, well, you know what, about time I took advantage of this for myself. Or am I going to use those talents, also the talents God has given me, for others? And I think that is one of the underlying stories in Harry Potter and what makes it so popular. And also has great lessons to teach. It's the struggle between Harry Potter, who has these gifts, magic, okay, but think about his talents. If you convert it into your mind into talents, you'll get the meaning of the story. And Draco Malfoy, right? One wants to use them for others. His tendency is to use them for others. And Draco Malfoy, his tendency is to use them for himself, to get control. That I think, is the struggle of that book from the beginning to the end. And it fascinates the world because it is a huge issue for everybody in the world. A way I like to think about a story like that is, there's Harry Potter inside us, and there's Draco Malfoy. In our heart, there's both. And the struggle is ongoing. And the third point in the analogy, you see from analogy how you can really bring a gospel passage alive. You connect it with something you lived. And the third point is that, and this is our experience. You can go back in your own lives and you'll see it. When we try to grab something, there's nothing there. A little bit like Eve tried to grab the fruit, right? There was nothing there. It's not what she thought it was going to be. I mean, we weren't novices we'd been novices for a few weeks when we all figured out that the receptionist was the worst and the hardest job. They missed all the good activities. We were like, oh, I'm so glad I'm not receptionist. When we go to grab something, it's an illusion. It's a complete illusion. And often brings us just misery. Not only the misery of having fought with everybody, but also the misery of finding out that it's not what we thought it was going to be. And so, in this Mass, let's turn to Christ here in the Eucharist as he comes down on the altar. And let's tell him, Lord, I want to use the talents that you have given me for you and for everybody else around me.